Welcome back to the place we find ourselves. I'm Adam Young, and today we are going to talk about sexual abuse that doesn't involve touch. In my counseling practice, I have found the phenomenon of subtle sexual abuse to be the root of much of what torments people, but it flies under the radar. Oh, how it flies under the radar. So let's begin with a provocative sentence. If your parents did not have a passionate, healthy marriage, a deep emotional connection, then it is likely that either you or your sibling has experienced some measure of subtle sexual abuse. Today, we're going to look at what it is, and I'll explain why that's the case. In my opinion, there is nothing on the planet that does more damage with less notoriety than subtle sexual abuse. So let's dive in. Let me say at the beginning that I am deeply indebted, as often is the case, to the work of Dan Allender, but also today to the work of a man named Kenneth Adams. Dan has written 2 books on sexual abuse, and Kenneth Adams wrote a book specifically on subtle sexual abuse, and it's called Silently Seduced: When Parents Make Their Children Partners. I will be quoting from Ken Adams' book several times today. One of the things everyone needs to do eventually in life is you need to draw a triangle. And on that triangle, write mom, dad, and you. The 3 points of the triangle are mom, dad, and you. The closeness of the points of the triangle represent the closeness of the relationship. And here's what it should look like. Mom and dad at the top, and the line connecting mom and dad is shorter than the lines connecting you at the bottom to either one of them. In other words, mom and dad are closer to each other than either one of them is to you. So what did your triangle look like growing up? Were you closer to your father than your mother was to your father? Or conversely, were you closer to your mother than your father was to your mother? If husband and wife are not passionately committed to engaging one another in love and honesty, in other words, if they are not regularly talking about their relationship and taking responsibility for how they are harming each other, talking through conflicts, if they don't have a deep emotional connection, if that stuff is not happening, then something called triangulation is inevitable. Triangulation means that one parent becomes closer to you, the child, than to their spouse. For example, your father begins to look to you to fill his needs because his wife is not there for him. Or conversely, your mom begins to look to you to connect with her emotionally because her husband is not there for her. If there is failure with your mother and father in regards to love, there will be triangulation. It's inevitable. When there is a failure of attunement between mom and dad will need to look somewhere for attunement because people need attunement. People need connection. So who did they get it through? It will be gotten through you or your sibling. Who was the face for your mother, given that your father was not? Who did your father turn to for connection, since his wife was not interested in him? Now, triangulation results in 2 deadly dynamics, and it was Dan Allender that first fleshed this out for me, and once he did, my life suddenly began to make sense. Here are the 2 deadly dynamics that result from being triangulated. Dynamic number 1. Your goodness is consumed by your opposite sex parent, usually the opposite sex parent. It doesn't have to be, but it often is. But here's the point. Dynamic number 1, your goodness is consumed. And dynamic number 2, as a result of that consumption, you are set up to be envied by your same-sex parent. So you're a 14-year-old girl and your parents don't have a deep and rich marriage. And so your dad starts looking to you rather than to his wife for connection. Dynamic number 1, the goodness that you bring with your presence is being consumed by your father. And dynamic number 2, As a result, your mother comes to envy you because she's not fond of the fact that her husband prefers you in many ways. If your parents were not deeply committed to each other on a day-to-day basis, if there was not a passionate love and care and concern between them, if they weren't each other's best friend, then you may know something about being consumed and something about being envied. By consumption, I mean that since your father knew that your mother wasn't there for him, he began to look to you to fill his needs. He began to consume the goodness that you brought with your presence. But what do you think your mom thought about the fact that your father chose you over her? Do you see the setup? You were set up to be envied by your mother, to be a rival. Here's the point. This is known as triangulation, and all triangulation is a form of subtle sexual abuse. Subtle sexual abuse occurs when a child becomes the object of a parent's affection, when the child becomes the person that the parent starts to lean on or turn to or confide in. And in time, the child is forced to act like a surrogate spouse to one of the parents, to act like a surrogate spouse. Subtle sexual abuse is far, far more prevalent than we think. The setup for subtle sexual abuse is a chronically troubled marriage in which one or both parents feel a loneliness or an emptiness because their spouse is not emotionally present and engaged. And as a result, one or both parents live with a deep, deep unmet needs for care, connection, companionship, and eventually, mom or dad begins turning to a child to get some of those needs met. Now, this dynamic places an immense burden on the chosen child. But please, please hear the next part. The chosen child won't feel a sense of burden at all. Quite the opposite. To the child, the relationship will feel loving and sweet and good and kind and connected and close. And as an adult, you will think back on your childhood and remember being highly attuned to your opposite sex parent, anticipating their needs, reading them well when they were upset, being there for them. You will feel close to the parent who is making you their surrogate spouse. You will feel close to the parent who is actually subtly sexually abusing you. But there is nothing loving or caring about a close parent-child relationship when it services the needs and feelings of the parent rather than the child. And let me say it again. There is nothing loving or caring about a close parent-child relationship when it services the needs and feelings of the parent rather than the child. This is so hard to get our heads around. If triangulation was true for you, then the nature of your story is that what felt like love wasn't. What felt like closeness and goodness and connection wasn't. That's very hard to come to terms with. And therein lies the dark power of subtle sexual abuse. Now, let me share the words of two men who are quoted in Silently Seduced, the book I mentioned by Ken Adams. Both of these men are trying to put language to what subtle sexual abuse looks like, what it feels like. And here's how one man puts it. There was mostly distance between my father and me. He never seemed to have much time for me and spent a great deal of time away from the house. I never could figure out why my parents stayed together. They didn't talk to each other much. I see now why my mother invested so much energy in me. Do you see it? Distance between he and his father, closeness between he and his mother. She invested so much energy in him, her son. Here's how another man puts it. I decided early on I was going to show my dad that I could be a better father than he ever was. Although I didn't know it at the time, I was also working on being a better husband than he was, a role my mother always seemed to welcome. Again, do you see the dynamic? Emotional closeness with mom combined with competition between the son and dad. Now, one of the heart-wrenching realities of children who are subtly sexually abused is that it feels really powerful and really good to be able to come through for your opposite sex parent. I mean, think of what an ego trip this is for a kid. Here are the words of a woman looking back on her relationship with her father. Again, this woman's quoted in Silently Seduced. And here's how she puts it. My father always had me by his side when I was growing up. I was his little sweetie. He and my mother didn't have much of a relationship, so I was the object he adored. When I was younger, I enjoyed all the attention and closeness. He and my mother didn't have much of a relationship, so I was the object he adored. When I was younger, I enjoyed all the attention and closeness. She quote unquote enjoyed all the attention and closeness, and there was goodness in it, but it was also deeply violating because her dad is looking to her instead of looking to mom for emotional connection and emotional closeness. She, the girl, the daughter, becomes the object that dad adores, not mom. Oh, how that wreaks havoc in a little girl's heart. But please hear the next phrase, it is rarely going to feel damaging to the girl. This is subtle. Here's a quote from a man. It felt so good to be able to make my mom stop crying and put a smile on her face. I was more than willing to be there for her. I felt so important and powerful. After a while, it seemed that my mother actually preferred my company over my father's. Do you see the subtle power of this? When this man was a boy, it felt good to be able to comfort mom, to come through for her, to help her stop crying, to put a smile on her face, to comfort her. He felt important and powerful and special. But he says it so well. After a while, it seemed that my mother actually preferred my company over my father's. Indeed, his mother is setting him up, is using him, is abusing him. She is consuming the goodness that he brings and using that goodness to meet her needs for a spouse. Now, it's important to understand the darkness of subtle sexual abuse. Whereas someone who is physically sexually abused, i.e. with touch, they are often going to feel, though not always, they're going to often feel like they've been abused. But the victim of subtle sexual abuse will not feel abused at all. Quite the opposite. They will feel idealized and privileged. The victim of subtle sexual abuse will never in a million years think of themselves as sexually abused. Why? Because your relationship with your opposite sex parent felt good. It felt sweet. It felt close. It felt connected. And it sure as heck felt better than your relationship with your same-sex parent who was often critical of you or distant from you. Because there was rivalry and there was enmity. Here's the kicker with subtle sexual abuse. Very often, you will live your whole life believing that the parent who abused you was the best parent you had. Very often, you will live your whole life believing that the parent who was subtly sexually abusing you was the best parent you had. Consider these words from a man, we'll call him John. He's quoted in Silently Seduced. And it's a full paragraph, but boy, does he paint the picture well. Here's how he says it. I thought I had the perfect parents. I was particularly fond of my mother because she was always there for me, to comfort me and talk. We talked about everything. Often, she talked about my dad. I always felt special around her because she trusted me with personal information. My father was also an attorney who loved his work. He seemed more married to it than to my mother. but he made sure we had everything, the best clothes, schools, whatever we wanted. It was hard to be angry with him. Besides, as a family, we seemed fine. There was never any overt family fighting or feuds. We seemed really close. I always felt special after one of my talks with Mom. I thought including me was my mom's way of making me feel special. And then here's the critical sentence. I had no idea. My mother was seducing me because she was lonely. Do you see it? John felt much closer to Mom than Dad. But Mom is the one who's sexually abusing him. He says, I always felt special around her because she trusted me with personal information. He felt special after his talks with Mom. And the way he interpreted their special closeness was, oh, Mom is just letting me in and being kind to me. She's including me. But the reality is his final sentence. I had no idea. My mother was seducing me because she was lonely. This is the core of subtle sexual abuse. Now, here's the thing that makes subtle sexual abuse so pernicious and so confusing. I mean, this is just madness. In the example that I just gave, John will feel like his mom is the good parent and his dad is the mean parent or the distant one. He will feel like mom's the good one and dad's kind of the bad one. The reality is that mom is sexually abusing him, and in so doing, she is setting him up to be hated and envied by his father. John was chosen by his mother to be her confidant, her companion, because John's father was emotionally checked out and wasn't interested in being a spouse to John's mother. But by choosing John, John's mother put John and his dad in competition with each other. The seduction by John's mother pitted John against his father because John's father naturally felt jealous. So as John grew up, he always had this sense that his dad didn't like him, but he didn't ever really know why. There was something that John couldn't put his finger on about why there was this competition between he and his father. When you have been subtly sexually abused, it can be very hard to name it. Very hard. Why? Well, here's how Ken Adams explains it. He says this: people will insist there is no harm in their close relationship to their opposite sex parent. Actually, they claim to feel special and privileged. These children were given a special position by being idealized by their opposite sex parent. But there is no privilege in being cheated out of a childhood by being a parent's surrogate partner. As adults, these individuals in turn idealize their parents to cover the pain of the abandoned and victimized child within. Now, let me flesh it out. Those last two sentences are so important. Number one, there is no privilege in being cheated out of a childhood. When you are required to function like a surrogate spouse to your mom or dad, your childhood is stolen. Why? Because you can't be a kid when you're being an adult. You can't be a kid when you are more preoccupied by your parents' emotional state than your own. And so your childhood is functionally stolen. You aren't connected to your needs, your desires, your wants, though there is no space for those because you are forced to attend to and attune to the neediness of your opposite sex parent. Now, sentence number two, this is how Ken Adams put it. As an adult, you will tend to idealize your parents. Why? Because it allows you to escape feeling the pain of naming all the devastating dynamics that were actually happening in your home. And so there's this massive pull inside to actually idealize your parents, especially the subtly sexually abusive opposite sex parent. So let me list four symptoms of people that have been subtly sexually abused. And I'm going to talk about these in the context of a woman who was subtly sexually abused by her father. You'll just have to make the pronoun adjustments in your mind to fit your situation. Okay, symptom number 1. On the one hand, you will feel privileged because of the special relationship you have with your father. On the other hand, you will feel like you are never able to do enough for him. Because as hard as you try, you can't fill the void in him. You just can't heal his pain. So you feel simultaneously special and yet somehow like you're not special enough. And this, of course, is absolute madness for you as a little girl or an adolescent girl. It's just madness. Symptom number 2, you will feel guilty about your own needs and probably have a difficult time identifying what they are because you were forced to focus on dad's needs rather than your own. There was no space for the legitimate needs that you had as a child. And so you feel guilty about your own needs, and you probably have a hard time even identifying your own needs, wants, desires, longings. Symptom number 3, as you think back on your childhood, there will be a sense of rivalry and competition with your mother. You will feel like she abandoned you in your growing up years or wasn't there for you. And indeed, this is precisely what dad set up by choosing you over her to be his confidant, his companion. And symptom number 4, you will likely have chronic feelings of inadequacy and unworthiness. Why? Because as hard as you tried, you could never give your dad what he was looking for. You couldn't ever fill up the void. Okay, let's end by talking about how you begin to recover from subtle sexual abuse. And this time I'll talk through this in the context of a man who was subtly sexually abused by his mother. So again, you'll have to make the adjustments in your mind to fit your situation. How does a subtly sexually abused man begin to recover? Number 1, name the reality that you were used. Used in the sense that your mother consumed your beauty and goodness and presence and masculine energy. This can be very hard to do because when most men first hear about subtle sexual abuse, their response is, wait a minute, if it weren't for my mother, nobody would have cared about me. I mean, dad certainly wasn't there for me. So even though my mom may have been overbearing or too close to me or too protective, at least she cared about my needs. It makes all the sense in the world that you would feel this way. But your mother's quote unquote care for you was more about her than about you. It's not that she didn't do caring things. Of course she did. But at times, they were designed to keep you close to her so that she could get what she needed from you. So, number 1, you have to name that your mother used you and consumed you. Number 2, name that your compass has been whacked your entire life. The person you thought was the good parent, namely your mother, was actually sexually abusing you. So your compass has been backwards. What you thought was true north, namely the kindness and care of your sweet mother, was actually due south. And conversely, the rivalry, the enmity, the jealousy, the criticism that you got from your father, what you thought was due south, actually is not the case. I'm not saying he was kind to you. I'm not saying that he necessarily loved you. I'm simply saying that his rivalry with you was set up by your mother. Now, number 3, begin to let go of and really to grieve your idealized image of your mother. Oh, this is so hard to do. Her excessive attention to you was not for you as much as it was for her, to gratify her needs for companionship and connection because her husband wasn't there for her. There is immense grief in this. Why grief? Because you're suffering a death, namely the death of what you thought was true of your mother, and the death of what you thought was true of your relationship with your mother. It wasn't the sweet, good, close, precious thing that you thought it was. Now, number 4, begin the process of separating from your mother if she is still alive. Set boundaries. Your mother bound your heart to hers, and you are likely at some level still bound. You need to break that bondage. You need to cut those cords. The byproduct of subtle sexual abuse is a lifelong trap of, I need to be there for mom because she has always been there for me. And even though this sentence will feel true, it's based on a lie. Your mom's preoccupation with you was more about her satisfying her neediness than it was about loving the real you, the child, the boy. Now, number 5, when it comes to your intimate relationships today, make your needs known. Make them a priority. As a child, you were forced to sacrifice your needs to tend to your mother's needs. The reason you did this was because you had hope that maybe if you could help mom feel better, then she would be able to be there for you and meet your needs. If I can fill up her emptiness, if I can somehow heal her, then she'll be able to mother me. And so now you find yourself married and stuck in this pattern of constantly trying to tend to your spouse so that maybe your needs will get met. Last, number 6, you have to take yourself off the pedestal that you have been put on. You have to come to terms with the fact that you are not special. Not in this way. Not in the way that she set you up to feel special. Your mother bound you to a feeling of being special, but this was based on your ability to come through for her, an adult, when you were a child. It was not based on who you really were as a special kid. You were never free to be a kid. There is immense grief in this. But in the grieving will come a new freedom, a new vitality, and a new sense of who you really are. And with that comes rest. At last. If there is anything that marks the lives of the subtly sexually abused, it is a profound lack of rest. Because you could never rest from the task of taking care of your opposite sex parent, of buoying them up, of reassuring them, of tending to them, of trying to be an adult spouse when you are actually a 12-year-old boy. One more thing that needs to be said at the end. It doesn't have to be the opposite sex parent that subtly sexually abused you. It can be the same sex parent. I have worked with many, many women who were chosen to be mom's surrogate spouse. Mom chose to look to the daughter as a husband, as a spouse. It happens. If you want to read more about subtle sexual abuse, I recommend checking out the book by Kenneth Adams called Silently Seduced: When Parents Make Their Children Partners. And also, I recommend chapter 5 of Dan Allender's book called Healing the Wounded Heart. Healing the Wounded Heart. And the focus of the chapter, the title of it is The Damage of Covert Abuse. Covert abuse, simply another term for subtle sexual abuse. Okay, that was a whirlwind. Thank you for listening. I know it was a lot, and it is not an easy subject to get our minds around. The nature of evil is subtlety. Ultimate evil is ultimately subtle. Subtlety is very important when it comes to trauma and abuse, and subtle sexual abuse, birthed in triangulation, is a real thing. And again, as I said at the beginning, in my opinion, there's nothing that does more harm with less notoriety than subtle sexual abuse.